Automation is key to digital transformation at organizations of all kinds, turbocharging efficiency and freeing up staff to engage in higher-level tasks. But too often, hand-printed information on forms and documents is standing in the way of automation, demanding extra time, effort, and cost to enter it accurately into a workflow system. But it doesn't have to be that way. Hi, I'm Stan Gibson, and I'll be your host for this live interactive webcast. Joining me to explore how to transform hand-printed information into usable data are four experts. Brandon Campbell, Director of Business Development at Ephesoft, who will moderate our discussion today. Welcome, Brandon. It's great to have you here for this webcast.
Hey, Stan. Thanks for having me.
Also joining us, Stephen Bowles, Senior Vice President of Strategy and Evangelism at Ephesoft. Welcome, Stephen, and thanks for joining us today.
Thank you. Excited for a great panel.
Also with us, Kevin Harbauer, Chief Technology Officer at Ephesoft. Welcome, Kevin. I'm glad you can be with us today.
Thanks, Dan. Excited to be here as well.
And David Beery, Senior Data Scientist at Ephesoft. Welcome, David. It's great to have you with us for this webcast.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Before we dive into our discussion, just a quick word about this webcast. Now, we are live and interactive, and we'd like to hear from you and our audience. Should a question occur to you at any time, just type it into the Q&A box on your screen, then press Submit. We'll do our best to answer your question during the Q&A segment of the webcast, and if not, you will receive an email reply within just a few days. Also, this webcast features several audience poll questions. When the question appears on your screen, please select your answer, then press Submit. We'll tally and discuss the results instantly. And now, I'll hand things over to Brandon Campbell. Brandon.
Thanks so much, Dan. So I want to start us off talking a little bit about hyper-automation, which I know is a little bit of a zig when we are talking about intelligent capture for Handprint. But we're seeing this term, it's entered the daily zeitgeist of technology and business leaders and enterprise organizations and government agencies, and I want to explain why. So just to summarize, hyperautomation is a concept for a state of organizational flow. And in terms of a solution, it can be made up of many different types of technologies in order to achieve efficiencies, productivity, increased revenue, customer retention, and more. And most CIOs are going to have some form of hyperautomation on their minds, in their daily plans or on their roadmap. But the approach and the focus for achieving hyperautomation, or if you're a technology vendor for providing hyperautomation, it's going to vary greatly from industry to industry for companies and organizational goals. So with that, I want to send this back over to Stan for our first and early poll question to kick us off.
Thanks, Brandon. Well, we want to engage with our audience right off the bat, and so we go now to our first poll question. I'm going to push the live poll, interactive poll to your screen now, and you'll see it appearing on your screen, and the question is, which would you rate as the most important technology for your organization in the hyper-automation stack? Now, all of these are going to be important, but your task is to choose the most important. Your choices are RPA, robotic process automation, analytics, content ingestion, NLP, natural language generation, or finally, process mining and process discovery. Fellow panelists, what do you think about this? We're going to give our audience about 30 seconds to make their selection, then hit the Submit button.
Now, this was an interesting. I was going to say this is an interesting one for me because hyperautomation kind of came into my, general frame of reference because so many of the RPA companies that were growing very quickly talked about it as this ultimate goal, and so that's kind of where my mind goes when I hear about this is RPA.
Well, I
agree. It'll be interesting.
Goes.
Yeah.
Certainly, there's RPA, but. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say it's interesting that it's at the top of the stack. So.
Well, certainly all of these do have some value, and process mining, process discovery, I think that's an intriguing one, uncovering gaps in efficiency, possible areas of improvement. It will be interesting to see how people respond to that one, I think. Well, people are still voting. We'll give them just a few more seconds to make their selection, then hit the all-important Submit button so their vote counts. All right. Okay, I think I'm going to close the polls now and we'll look at those results. Well, interesting. RPA is in first place, strongly in first place, fellow panelists, but the other choices are certainly well represented, with the exception of NLP, natural language generation and natural language processing. Any thoughts about those results, Brandon?
Yeah, I'm curious about the lack of NLP as a voting category. I know in general it's important, as you're saying, with new technologies that have so much unstructured content when you're looking at social media and the prevalence of kind of social outreach and interaction with organizations and how they take in that data. So I'm curious why that didn't get any hits, but yeah, that's kind of about what I thought.
Other panelists, any other thoughts?
No surprises
I
there.
can do. Yeah, I can compare this with a recent, actually, Gartner survey. So in late 2020, Gartner put together a survey for consulting clients. And these are the responses in terms of importance. So 5 being the most important thing to consider for hyperautomation plans, 0 being the least important. And interestingly enough, in our poll results, content ingestion was ranked, I think, tied in one of the lower places, along with possibly process mining. But in more than thousands of companies surveyed here by Gartner, content ingestion was the most important aspect of hyperautomation. And from my perspective, this is a huge validator, and the fact that, yes, RPA is important. Yes, analytics and getting data-driven insights are important. But if you don't have the raw data to fuel that output, to fuel those process automation tools, you're not going to have a complete picture, and you're not going to be able to fully automate. And it just kind of hammers home the importance of unstructured data capture, content capture, how we're working with data as a whole to kind of process everything else below it. So for me, that was just a little bit of validation. Now, with that in mind, please, Dan, go ahead.
Sorry, Brandon, I just wanted to add, we are talking about hyper-automation, which means automating the automation. And it occurred to me in looking at those results, you've got RPA as a very, very close second there. But if you're ingesting content in an automated fashion and then handing it off to an RPA system, a lot of action is happening before there's any human intervention at all as content comes into an organization. And that certainly is a great leap forward for efficiency. And I think any organization that is implementing those two technologies in tandem is going to realize lower costs and also higher quality customer service, because those customer-facing processes are happening rapidly and automatically. Back to you.
Yeah, absolutely. No, yeah, I mean, it's a good point. It kind of leads us into a couple of other points we want to chat about here. And to start, just to kind of give a little bit of background here for the audience, just for clarity, ICR is intelligent character recognition, or it's the process of converting handprint into something that's machine readable, text that's machine readable through pixel identification and through contextual analysis. And even just 2 or 3 years ago, ICR engines in the market would barely get 30% accuracy for unstructured, free-form, hand-printed text, cursive handwriting. And it was just generally assumed across the world of document capture and archival document separation that it just wasn't possible. But thanks to some online crowdsourcing efforts of just a few big tech companies, handprint conversion accuracy has just absolutely skyrocketed. And it's widely available with an API call to the cloud. So as this has drastically changed the way we look at document capture automation projects and the effectiveness of new document-centric processes, this has an impact on hyperautomation and ties back into that number one most important factor for most companies, how we're capturing unstructured content. And handprint is such a big part of that, more than I would have expected in the year 2021. So I want to open up the panel to talk a little bit about RPA and handprint working in tandem, which, we talked about in the Gartner survey, the number 2 most important top technologies for the concept of hyperautomation. So Steve, if you want to start it off, the success of RPA companies, the emergent success of iPaaS or integration platform as a service vendors have just emphasized the market demand for this type of technology. But we see a ton of studies about how often these projects fail and how there are blockers around unstructured data. And I would love to get your input on, where you think these two fit together and what it takes to have a successful project.
Yeah, it's interesting. RPA kind of created a renaissance in the intelligent document processing space. Essentially, when they went in and started automating these processes to disparate systems, what they found is that 60% or more of the time there's documents or records involved. So grabbing that data and having it ahead of time in that content ingestion that you already discussed just became so important to fully automating those processes. It's really been interesting. Most of them have created their own document processing plugins, or they've partnered with companies that have best-in-class solutions. So.
Mm-hmm. Have you seen that, Stan, or Kevin, in your experience? What do you guys see as working with RPA and document capture hand in hand?
Brandon, if I might just chime in, I think the ability to ingest and utilize unstructured content is very important, unstructured data. But when you're bringing data into your organization, you've got to have clean data. That means normalized data, making sure that the data is accurate. There's only one version of the truth. So that obviously needs to be applied if you're going to be analyzing this data or using it in a constructive way.
Oh, yeah, I definitely see that kind of in the light of analytics, especially, even more so than RPA. I'm sorry, Kevin, were you going to add to that?
Yeah, I was just going to add there's another aspect to this too. Is I think one of the challenges we see with the success in some of these RPA projects is they're built on this notion that data is almost static, right? They're built on these kind of legacy data structures and this idea that the data structure won't change. But what we know is that it's just not true. In enterprise data structures, and the data is constantly changing and evolving, and that's where you start getting into challenges with the RPA, kind of breaking down. So I think, thinking about how that data structure changes and evolves, especially when you're thinking about unstructured data, is absolutely critical, and you have to solve for that as you start looking at automation.
Yeah, that's a really good point. The repetitive nature of taking a process and automating that very static process with a bot is, like you said, static. But when you take into account variable data that might not necessarily fit neatly into that repetitive process, there is that gap there. That's an interesting thought. All right, so I guess something I wanted to dive into a little bit as well is talking about industry-specific factors when we look at handprint data and automation. I'm sure everyone, is well aware that, government, whether it's state and local or federal, is a series of forms, and that's kind of ubiquitous across all government everywhere in the world. It's forms, and the vast majority of these forms come in various formats. They have multiple options for attachments, and a lot of them are submitted in handprint. But we see a lot of handprint data in our particular industry and intelligent capture in commercial as well. You get into banking and insurance and not-for-profit agencies, you're still seeing client and outside submissions of, consumer or customer data in the form of handprint. And that's a huge manual undertaking to be able to grab that information and to turn it into something usable, either for data-driven insights or for processes. And an interesting story, just from my own personal experience, is seeing the kind of Vesica Pisces where public sector and private sector meet. In one particular case, I was working on a project with an organization that was trying to help with project closure for Hurricane Katrina, which has been, more than 15 years ago at this point, I believe. And the city of New Orleans, the state of Louisiana, were still trying to close out vendor accounts and close out some of these outstanding invoices for the cleanup efforts and the rebuilding efforts from Hurricane Katrina. And some of the issues that they were facing is that they were dealing with handprint invoices and bills of lading that had handprint information on it. And it was just this massive amount of information that they couldn't really figure out how to deal with other than throwing a million people at the problem and going through and manually grabbing all of that data. So it's a challenge no matter what industry that you're in. And not only is it a challenge in the industry, it's also something to look at when you're internal to the organization or external to the organization. So I want to open this back up to the panel, and I have a question, Stan, for you specifically. In one of your recent articles on CIO.com, you talked a little bit about the imperative of innovation and automation in an organization's both internal and external ecosystem. And I was wondering if you could expand on that a little bit. Where do you see the benefits of handwritten data internally to the organization or outside of it?
Brandon, certainly there are benefits for handprint recognition both externally and internally. I think we're going to see the use of both for some time to come. But in what we might call the external ecosystem, I think we can think of that as B2B relationships. And those can be greatly streamlined when handprint data ingestion is automated. The internal ecosystem, on the other hand, would consist of things like ERP, CRM, human capital management, things like that. That also needs to ingest handprint data. Now, when both external and internal ecosystems are operating with fully automated data, they can exchange data between the applications, and there are no roadblocks standing in the way when the applications need to talk to each other. Now, that's a formula, really, for a much more efficient business overall.
Yeah, I think, Brandon, when you look at typically most of what we see today is folks that want to consume external content, right? Consume that external content, bring it into the organization in a nice, pretty structured way, whether it's a healthcare organization that's taking, surveys, bringing in and analyzing those surveys, a nonprofit that's bringing in donor cards. So typically what I see on a day-to-day is that external to internal transition.
Yeah, I see that as well. And I'm guessing it's kind of a conversation between operational efficiency and, consumer retention and increased revenue, that internal or external. Kevin, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I think when you think about external, certainly the kind of the business-to-business type transactions, one of those. But I don't think we can kind of overlook the consumer side of things. I mean, there's still a ton of handprint type data being generated from consumer, and that consumer could be, a patient in the health system that's trying to, they have to sign a form when they come in for their appointment, and there's all these things that might fall into that consumer category that are generating health print and probably will be for quite a long time, and so being able to accommodate that in addition to the external business to business is going to be critical.
Yep, that all makes sense. So basically, whether you're trying to do business with somebody or whether you're working inside of an organization, it's massive, and it's not necessarily going away anytime soon. I would say, especially even with the pandemic, seeing people not necessarily have access to, tools to be able to print out forms they've, completed online and have to do handprinting. So there's a lot to it. Now, specifically around handprint data, I did a little bit of research, and I wanted to share some information I found around how much handprint data we see and about internet access, because the two things kind of go hand in hand. So to start, there was a survey just from earlier this year by Statista, and in that survey, about 85% of Americans reported having regular access to the internet. However, the vast majority of those Americans that reported access had access through their mobile devices. So while there is still this, grand theory around online form submission or mobile optimized websites where you can submit information online, you still have, people only being able to access their phone, and you have organizations and government agencies that aren't able to submit information, online. So basically what agencies, what organizations have to do is cater to the lowest possible common denominator in terms of how they can expect information to come into their organization. And they have to adopt that consumer-friendly approach. I think about, for example, my mom, who lives about 300 miles from me, sent me an email of a form that she needed to submit for some benefits, so that I could print it out and then mail it back to her so that she could mail in, because she had no way to do it where she is in a fairly rural area. And that's more common than you would expect. And government specifically, according to a Forum Research survey that was conducted back in 2016, and I'm sure it's grown since then across the 68 largest federal agencies, there were 23,000 forms that were actively in use. And these are forms that could literally be printed out and submitted, and forms that those agencies accepted, mailed in submissions, whether it's internally handed in, agency to agency, or from constituents. And then if you take a look at the OMB has this running tally online, and it's just this great website to watch the numbers pick up on for the government-wide total money and man-hours spent on form submission, which a huge portion of that is handprint data. And the annual cost to date for online form submission, you'll see in this bottom right-hand corner of the screen. And this is for information that was submitted for forms, whether it's a application to an agency, a background investigation, a permit request. That's a massive amount of money being spent on manual data collection and processing. And that's where we see so much potential around what we can do with handprint information and how we can help automate some of that. So I want to kick this back over to the panel, and I want to figure out where do you guys think the greatest impact is going to be on an organization or a government agency when they have ease of access to hand-printed data? I gave a pretty niche example with the Hurricane Katrina thing, but I'm curious if you see other industries from your personal experience where this is just rife.
Well, Brandon, Stan chiming in. It's funny you should ask, because just the other day I was filling out an insurance reimbursement form, and I live in an area where everyone has internet access. I have very high-speed internet access. I don't really want to use a paper form, and yet I had to use one. I had to print out the form, fill it out, and mail it in. So certainly, even in advanced environments, handprint and paper forms, they're certainly very, very prevalent.
I'd chime in, Brandon. I think obviously I agree with Stan. Insurance is a place where it's quite common. Healthcare in general. Just last week I went for a checkup and I had to fill out paper forms on anything that's happened since my last checkup. It's always handwritten. So I think healthcare is one of the biggest.
Oh, yeah. And Kevin, I know you've recently dealt with a couple of large mailroom projects. Was handprint a factor in any of those?
Yeah, I think you've touched on them already, but, any type of a large mailroom situation, whether it's a public sector or a large organization, especially I think it's really come to light during over the last year during the pandemic, is like, how do you process that mail traffic when there's, no one can work, everyone has to work from home. And so, that's one area, and I always, maybe because I spent so much time in healthcare, I just go back to the healthcare. It just still boggles my mind that after all the energy we put into electronic medical records and becoming digital in healthcare, so much of it is still forms and handprint, and that just boggles my mind still.
Yeah, I definitely feel that pain. It actually makes me think of the IRS when you have to submit a tax form that can be submitted completely digitally, but if you need to explain a deposit in your account or a change in your income based on what was submitted, everything is handprint. So you could literally be writing letters that, again, manually processed by individuals reading through them. It's insane the amount of information that's still submitted that way. And I'm so sorry, I think I cut someone off. Was someone else going to add in there?
Yeah, David here. I just wanted to chime in as well. I think there's obviously a lot of focus on the larger industries, but it's also difficult to imagine somewhere that wouldn't benefit from some kind of ICR analysis built into their systems. If you think about anyone who has access to a pen and is working on something, chances are they'll jot down a note somewhere in their process. And that can enrich an analysis tremendously. Even if it's as simple as some sort of correction note to self, our natural tendency as humans is to write something that's going to be useful. And that can largely affect, even if it's just a few words or a short sentence on an otherwise structured document. can change how we approach an analysis or what our sort of inferential outcomes are.
Mm-hmm.
So you don't have to be a large industry to benefit.
Yeah, Brandon, to expand on that example, it's quite common. One of our most common use cases is accounts payable. It's quite common for accounts payable clerks to write missing information at the top of the page or in the border, like a PO number or some type of vendor reference. So there's still that kind of hybrid document that comes through that's created digitally, but maybe has a note like Dave mentioned.
Oh, it's the same kind of use case you're talking about, that hybrid where you have a contract and the lawyer going through it jots out a note and writes at the bottom, actually payment terms are supposed to be 45, not 30. And then everyone signs it, and that's the formal official contract. And it's, you see it incredibly frequently. If you were simply to go through that with a, OCR conversion, that information doesn't exist and could cause huge issues down the road. All right. So with that, what I think we want to do is hop into another poll question. Stan, if you could take it over.
Sure, Brandon. Thank you. We do have the next poll question coming up. Before we go to that, though, I'd like to remind members of our audience, please send us your questions. Just type it into the Q&A box on your screen, press submit, and we'll do our best to answer it during the Q&A segment, which is coming up shortly. Going to that second poll question now. It appears on your screen, and the question is, what types of handwritten documents are most common in your organization? And, well, you've got four choices: internal employee use forms, external customer or constituent application forms, correspondence or mailroom, or finally, we don't have any documents with hand-printed data. So please make your selection, hit the submit button, and we'll give you about 30 seconds to do that. But we talked a lot about external customer-facing forms. Probably, I'm thinking that's going to be the top vote getter here, fellow panelists. Any thoughts at all?
Yeah, I'd probably say that as well. At all costs, people tend to try to avoid things that are going to create more work internally, but it's also just, it's easier sometimes. Actually, if I can chime in really quickly, something one of our audience members mentioned was seeing a huge amount of handprint in banking, that you have bank customers that might have been with the bank for many, many years will always prefer to write a handwritten letter because it feels more formal or more official than to send something electronically. And I think you'll see a good amount of generational impact on what is or isn't being sent or brought into the organization with handprint. So I'm curious if that impacts this poll too.
All right. Well, I think the audience has pretty much finished voting, so let's take a look at those results. Certainly not a surprise here. External consumer or constituent application forms is in first place, but interestingly, internal employee use forms. Now, I think that's one area where a company could say we're going to, all computerized. We're not going to use any hand-printed forms anymore. But many of them apparently do not. Any thoughts there?
I find it interesting that nobody said we don't have any documents with hand-printed data.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, that's the elephant in the room there, that last one, 0%.
Mm-hmm. It's kind of the same use case when you hear someone else say, like, oh, we've gone digital, we don't deal with documents anymore. And then the only deal with this documents. It's a hard thing to move away from, and it's a very slow shift from a technology perspective.
Absolutely.
All right, so are we good to move on then here?
Yeah, let's keep going.
All right, perfect. So I want to talk a little bit about leveraging technology specifically. So we talked about the emergence of reliable, fast, accurate handprint data, and how companies like Google and Amazon or Microsoft have kind of revolutionized how we get handprint accuracy up. But what you actually do with that handprint data is it's very important as well, just having it as step one. And the use of AI for handprint to machine readable text, it's important that you have that raw data. So now what do you do? Well, AI and machine learning and natural language processing, which is something that was called out as one of the important components of hyperautomation, They all contribute to the manner in which processes can be automated and insights can be gained through content source data. And unlike intelligent document capture or legacy document capture limitations of years past, it shouldn't necessarily take months or years to see the benefits of having to train a capture system to identify and to extract the relevant data from unstructured documents, whether it's an invoice or a contract or a purchase order or a doctor's note. So I want to turn this back over to Stan for our last quick poll on what kind of data your company deals with as it relates to handwriting. And then we're going to get into some fun stuff to chat with our resident data scientist about his experience with Handprint.
All right, thanks,
Dan?
Brandon. Yes, thank you very much. Let's go to that third and final poll now. And the question is, if you have a document data capture solution already in place, does it extract handwritten data accurately? Interesting question. And your choices are all the time, some of the time, rarely, or we don't have a capture solution. Well, fellow panelists, while we're waiting for our audience members to make their selection and then press submit, I'm going to vote preemptively for some of the time, because none of these things are maybe 100% perfect. And yet, as we pointed out, I think the technology has improved significantly. What are your thoughts?
I think a lot of the legacy. Oh, go ahead, Kevin.
Oh, sorry, I'm jumping on you. I was just going to kind of agree with you. I think things have gotten better. The technology has come so far, so fast, but at the end of the day, you're still dealing with humans and all of the idiosyncrasies that go into how we write things. You know, lines can be skewed. You know, date formats are different. Papers can be crumbled before they're faxed or scanned. So there's just so many variables that go into extracting, handprint and paper documents. That, yeah, I'm definitely with you on some of the time.
Yeah, and on that note, so most of the document capture products that are out there and that are pervasive across the globe mostly deal with structured forms, right? We all know those EMV type documents where you fill in the boxes, right, and you print nice and neat. Things have really changed since those solutions were out. That's 15, 20-year-old technology. So it'll be interesting to see the answers to this and see how many folks are using modern products.
Well, let's take a look at those answers now. All right. Well, we have rarely being the big winner here. Interesting result, but all the time gets 0, a big goose egg. But some of the time, is this a little too pessimistic for you here in terms of quality of recognition? Thoughts there?
I mean, I think that kind of something I mentioned earlier, this is the ability to produce accurate results from handprint technology is relatively new. Like I said, being in this industry for a few years, even 2 years ago, saying we're going to get 80, 90, 95% accuracy on handprint would have been the biggest laughable joke in the world. You'd be lucky to get 30%. But you have, these big tech companies throwing a lot of money, a lot of time at the ability to, take that information and make it machine readable. That's pretty new, so it doesn't surprise me, actually.
Yeah, to step in here and give a little more insight as well, you're completely right. In the last couple of years, I think most people are probably familiar with the GPT-3 system that OpenAI developed and how incredible it is at natural language processing. Well, the same technology that drove that just 8-9 months ago here is the same technology that is being used to improve handwritten capture, and so. Realistically, I mean, the time to market for a new product like that, we're really just seeing some of these better systems being implemented. I mean, as we're speaking, companies are working on getting things to production. So you're right; it's a very new technology. I'm not surprised that rarely is the most common answer, because all the legacy technologies will fall in that category, I believe.
Yep. I mean, once we start looking into accuracy rates, especially when we get into like cursive handprint, kind of the sky's the limit there. Kevin, you talk about healthcare a lot, and there's a reason for that. You have Doctors and nurses' notes are primarily handprint because it's fast and it's easy and it's what you have accessible, but then that data goes into a dark hole and it makes it very hard to do, predictive analytics on some of the information and to get better, healthcare information out for purposes of diagnostics. And I think now that we're seeing that increase in handprint accuracy and handwriting accuracy, I just think it's going to absolutely amplify everything else we could do in that space. All right, so I want to take this just a little step further from a panel perspective. And Dave, thank you for hopping in here. I have a question for you specifically because we're looking at, old tech, if we want to consider handprint as, basically cave drawings. With new tech is the ability to just have a machine look at it and understand what it is. We're marrying this old and this new format. And for you, Dave, what do you see as some of the big challenges for incorporating handprint data to structured data sets? I mean, you mentioned earlier, just having that information can be valuable, but just because you have the information doesn't necessarily mean it's actionable or usable. So how do we marry this new unstructured blob of text with what you could get from analytics or what could be done with process automation?
Absolutely. So a lot of it is contextual based. Whether or not we're dealing with a fixed form document, some kind of governmental form that needs to be filled out, or if we have a more free form document that doesn't necessarily have that structure, we can't rely on, say, positional information. And so the ability to convert from this available data, this searchable data, into usable data depends on the context and the systems that are being designed. So for the most part, we can view handwriting in a free-form system as something that enriches the insight. It informs our analysis. When we have a legal document and we understand that there is a certain structure to the digital text, but then we also have handwriting. Well, that handwriting is going to serve a very special purpose. And incorporating that understanding that and how it occurs, as well as its actual semantic information as a language, is going to really build up our analysis and allow us to do deeper insights into those kinds of documents. And so the challenge then is being able to build a system and maintain a system that is able to marry those contextual cues from the document and whether or not the handwriting is expected, if it's not expected, and then using that to transform it into a usable data-driven system.
So that kind of ties into, Stan, your point around clean data, right?
Yeah, well, I think very much it does. And also, I think it makes me think of improving customer service. We had our audience member talk about sending handwritten letters to banks, how maybe a very senior and valuable bank customer might want to communicate with his or her bank that way by hand. And that information you get from that kind of valued customer is like gold. They're giving you honest feedback, perhaps. Maybe they didn't have a good experience. It's really, really important to respond to that, to be able to ingest it, analyze it, and then have it spur some sort of constructive action. So I would say if you consider the amount of effort that organizations take to try to stay in touch and track customers, when you get direct feedback from a customer, it's really fantastic to be able to analyze it, especially in a structured way, and pull valuable content out of it.
I think that touches, just to follow up on that, I think that touches on the idea of that it enriches a solution. So handprint by itself, if we simply convert it into a digital format, again, we run into this, it's not really usable. Someone still has to read it, but it can then inform something like a sentiment analysis. This idea of feedback where we can gauge the sentiment of the feedback. Is it positive? Is it negative? Maybe there are particular points that could be classified in that feedback and say, we already know 12 areas we need to improve in. Turns out that this is another feedback piece of information in one bucket. And over the course of several of these letters, we discover that we really need to improve one major area. So this handwriting really enriches existing systems beyond what's just available through digitally native information.
So that's a good point, Dave, and that actually makes me think about kind of the core definition of hyperautomation. It's all of these different technology stacks working in tandem. So it's not just the component of capture, it's a component of capture tied into natural language processing or natural language generation. It's not just NLP, it's NLP tied into analytics, having that presented in a way that you could actually run reports on and get information from. So it's how all of these technologies work together, but it starts at the point of simply making that letter into something actionable, correct?
Absolutely. Much more concise than
Brandon.
mine.
Yeah, I'd also add, when we look at old and new, the new systems, the AI systems that are being built by our technologists are dynamic and interpretive, right? Whereas the old systems were very static, very rigid. I think that transition, as we get more and more into this new technology, that dynamic capability to extract that data and make it available is really what's driving all this change with the new technology.
And this is actually just a really good lead into this next question. And Kevin, I would love your input on this specifically, because we keep kind of dancing around the topic of, these different pieces of a larger solution. And an ICR engine, which is largely what, Google or Microsoft has provided, this engine that takes that letter and turns it into something that's machine readable. That's one component of intelligent document processing and automation around capture. But there are so many other things that goes into it. And you get into a lot of discussions around build versus buy, and should I take that raw data and try to build something myself? Should I buy something off the shelf? And Kevin, and from your perspective, I would love your input as a CIO to, what are the things that you think about when you're looking at building something versus buying something versus incorporating other technology, even for us internally? What do you think about this aspect of just technology in general?
Yeah, it's a great question, and part of me is still surprised that after all these years, we still have this conversation. Primarily because when I think about this, and it doesn't matter whether you're considering a intelligent document processing system or an ERP system or a CRM system. What I think about is the people. Think about how hard it is to hire and retain really good people. So your people, are clearly your number one asset. And so do you want to deploy those people on building something that you can get off the shelf, or deploy them on building something that you can't get, which is going to be more valuable to your organization? And so that's one of the things I look at, so if I can buy something off the shelf that meets the majority of my requirements, I'm going to invest my, very critical and valuable resources in building those things that I can't get off the shelf. And then the other thing I see people do is, that when they look at total cost of ownership, because that's one of the common ways you do this, is you compare total cost of ownership from purchasing to building, but they frequently leave out the cost of maintaining when they calculate that TCO for building. And, there's tons of studies out there, but if you boiled it down, you're generally going to spend 3 to 4 times as much maintaining something you've built. And so you really got to make sure if you're set on building something, really make sure you do it total cost of ownership and bring in the cost of maintaining it, because it's a lot more than most people think.
Well, I'd like to offer.
I think go ahead, Stan.
No, sorry. I'm just going to offer some violent agreement with that point. I think the opportunity cost of missing out on another strategic project because you're spending time on a handprint data recognition project is probably very, very significant, and you're probably much better off leveraging the knowledge of external systems that are designed to handle it.
Yeah, I think we've had this discussion many times, Brandon. OCR, ICR are really just a very small piece. I think 10% is what we talked about of the overall solution. It's all the stuff before and all the stuff after. Things like image processing, normalization, and then after the fact, validation, exceptions processing, integration with the system of record. Those are typically missed. and which ends up providing low levels of accuracy, and people miss on their efficiency goals.
Yep, and it's kind of highlighted there with the whole the engine, not the car. There are so many different components of technology that make up a larger solution, and that's the norm rather than the exception today. You have very niche applications that focus on a particular area and then can be combined with other applications to achieve a larger goal. And so looking at, ICR, handprint conversion as very one small component of this larger process, I think is pretty critical. So
yeah, and coming from the point of view,
go ahead.
Oh, sorry, just one last point on that. From the point of view of someone who is always being told to build things by Kevin, he made some excellent points, but having the appropriate data, it's not just clean data that we're worried about. It's whether you have focused data as well. So if you're going to be building something, you need to understand that there is a minimum amount of data necessary to accomplish a goal, and oftentimes it's underestimated by about 10 times the amount of data to make a good, usable production product. And that's something I think shocks a lot of people. I've also run into cases where I've been working with companies that have terabytes and terabytes of data, just tens of millions of samples. But that data can't actually build their technology. You can't squeeze blood from a turnip. And if your data isn't objective-oriented and you can't train some kind of AI system on it, then even if you have all the data in the world and it seems like it's appropriate, may not be, and that technology will fail. So I think that's another area that is underestimated quite often.
Well, with that very gruesome graphic of blood dripping from a turnip in my mind, thank you for that one, Dave. I'm going to open us up to something that I think is relevant here, and we've touched on it a little bit. It's just when does handprint technology when does that get sunsetted? When are we done with handprint? Is there a point, whether it's generationally or a time perspective, a use perspective, that we don't see handprint anymore? Steve had mentioned to me previously, they're not teaching kids handprint or cursive in schools now. Does that mean handwriting's going away further? And I want to open this up to the panel here. Kevin, I have another question for you, actually. Is there a point that you think this technology, does it meet its maker? I mean, from a perspective of Ephesoft, from our company, we're investing in this technology and incorporating this capability into our tool set. What was the driver there, and how far do you see into the future of this being, highly usable?
Yeah, I think this is a great question, and it goes along the line as when do we think paper will go away? How long have we been hearing paper is going away? We won't need printers, we won't need scanners and all of that, but yet here we are. Even if we see the production or the creation of handprint or handwriting on documents go down over time, think about that legacy data set. Just think about all of the terabytes, exabytes of data that's handprint and sending in an electronic medical record and other silos, and all of the insights that could be, hidden in there. And so, I think the need to extract handprint and handwriting is going to be around probably long after I retire.
Yeah, I would think, Brendan, when you think about, to expand on Kevin's idea, when you think about all of the data that is sitting in handwritten documents, just the capability to search those and extract data from them from a historical and a research perspective, the value, you can't even calculate the value with the number of documents that are out there.
I think I'm going to agree that handwriting is not going to go away in the foreseeable future. At the same time, customers expect improved customer service. Customer expectations are increasing all the time. So companies, I think, that are slow to adopt handprint recognition technology are not going to compare favorably with competitors with regard to customer service.
I'd agree with that, and I think that there's the expectation as well from a provider of services, as you know, as a government agency, to be able to provide kind of public sector level experience with technology that might be 5 or 10 years behind what you'd find in the public sector. So adopting a capture solution that supports handprint data capture, handprint data conversion as a part of those core processes to help, maintain and provide that same level of service, I think is going to be important for budgets and cost saving as well. All right, so with that, I'd love to open it up to some of the questions we've gotten in Q&A. So Stan, if you want to take it back over.
Absolutely, Brandon. It is time now for the Q&A segment. If you have not yet sent us a question, there's still time to do so. Just type it into the Q&A box and then press submit. We do have a number of very interesting questions already in the queue, so let's begin with those. First question is, we talked about cursive handwriting, and the question is, will this extraction technology work on cursive handwriting?
Kevin, you want to take that one? Or
okay,
Dave, I know you guys have done a ton of work with the handprint stuff. You're fine.
Yeah, I was just wasn't sure who was going to jump in on that one. But yeah, I think, clearly when you start talking about cursive, the variability, is just infinite. It certainly works. The levels of accuracy may differ from, something like a handprint that can be constrained. So you kind of got to go into projects with that idea. But certainly, I think just like the solutions are getting better every day with handprint, I think cursive and handwriting is also improving.
Well, we do have a comment from an audience member. Sorry. I was just going to say we have a comment from an audience member that the cursive handwriting needs to improve. I think that's something that we can always agree on.
Yeah, I think a lot of it is also conditioned by expectations going in. If you expect it to have poor performance, you'll actually be surprised these days at how excellent it has gotten. If you're expecting it to be perfect, you're going to be a little disappointed because, as Kevin said, there's infinite variation. It's very difficult to capture all of that potential variation and get a perfect system. So we're somewhere in between there that I think most people will be very pleasantly surprised at just how well it works on standard cursive, is my input.
I think something to note about all of this as well is that, the improvement we've seen from 2 years ago to now and the accuracy of conversion with something like the cloud-based technologies is massive. So the improvement that we can continue to expect to see, I think is there. And I think that's an important thing to note, that when you're using this type of technology, you're always going to be querying something in the cloud. An on-premise solution is very rarely going to get you the accuracy that you need just because of the process and compute power required to put all of those cycles into that image and get you that output. So the combination of like the pixel identification, all of the libraries that it's querying, the contextual analysis that is done to say whether it's an I or a number one. And so you're going to be reaching out to the cloud for that conversion. And because you're going to be reaching out to the cloud, it's, good to know that that recognition engine will more than likely be continually improving. And so what might not work, with great accuracy today could drastically change in 3 months or 6 months or a year.
Really quickly on that too, Brandon, I think what folks need to do is focus on the business outcome. What does it mean to your business if 80% of the hand keying is no longer required? What about 90? What about those types of things? So looking at the business outcome and the effect that a certain level of accuracy can have can help you justify the purchase of a solution.
All right, let's continue on to our next question. And the next question is, if you have different types of documents where one ICR, OCR tool won't work for different types, Clearly, one tool is not the solution. Do you recommend a set of OCR, ICR tools to be used, or should we wait for that one or two tools that will give good results for most different types of documents?
So my gut instinct on this is that we're quickly moving towards a singularity of OCR, ICR systems, where we'll have several offerings of different tools. All of them will be highly generalizable across multiple document types, multiple handwriting styles, even multiple languages, potentially. If there is a system that isn't working, it might be time to look at some of the more recent releases, more modern technology that has integrated some of our more cutting-edge advances in AI that will give good results across everything. Chances are, if you have a system that isn't performing well on different documents and you move up to a more modern system, you'll be getting better results across all documents simply because of the advances we've made even in the last year for AI in ICR and OCR systems.
I see. Good answer. Next question. How quickly will I see value from purchasing a capture solution for hand-printed documents? Anyone? ROI?
I mean, I can jump in on the implementation just from a quickness. Maybe Steve, you want to follow up, but you know what I think about is most of these systems are pretty good out of the box, right? It's like you can get to a certain level of accuracy on day one, and so that's one thing you want to look at is like on day one, how much accuracy can you get to? And then you got to start thinking about the cost of getting beyond that. So let's say day one, you're 80% accurate, and then over a period of months, you're training the system and tuning it, and you're able to get to that 90% accuracy. I think that's kind of how I think about it. It's if you go into it with this expectation that it should just work with 100% accuracy on day one, kind of back to Dave's point, you might be disappointed, but if you go into it thinking that it's not going to work at all, you're going to be surprised at how good the system will work on day one.
And I think you need to look at current state, right? If you have 10 processors hand keying information, you can pretty quickly build your current costs. Typically with our systems, we see 60, 70, sometimes up to 90% time reduction. From an extract, when we do the auto extraction and you're able to validate and do QA. So it's pretty easy to calculate start state, end state, and look at the savings over time. And then obviously, as Kevin said, as things improve, it just becomes added gravy on top of the savings. So.
All right. We have time for one more question, and the question is, the solution itself is a breath of fresh air. How is it going to handle the data overlap, as we know that this has also been a concern throughout? Moreover, in handwritten, it's not very obvious in nature to overlap. A little bit difficult to understand, but would anyone like to take a crack at that one?
I'm guessing it's like character overlapping, like if an O and a T overlap. It would be my assumption. Does that sound about right?
Yeah, that would be my initial guess as well, and I think the answer to that is going to be that we're getting much better at disambiguating types of print and handwriting, especially in the cases of overlap. A lot of times you'll see large print letters that do go over digital text, but our ability to sort of isolate those cases and ignore one or the other while processing is getting much better. And so there will still be some cases that we're simply not able to handle, but by and large, you should start seeing that the text is properly being processed and integrated in order as much as possible that makes sense to the machine or the AI system.
I see. Well, I think that's a good answer. Well, that is all the time we have in this live interactive webcast. Special thanks to our discussion moderator, Brandon Campbell, Director of Business Development at Ephesoft. And thanks to our experts, Stephen Bowles, Senior Vice President of Strategy and Evangelism at Ephesoft, Kevin Harbauer, Chief Technology Officer at Ephesoft, and David Beery, Senior Data Scientist at Ephesoft. Thanks to all for a lively exploration of the future of process automation technology and the role of handprint data in digital transformation. For more information on this topic, please take a look at the resources area of your webcast player. You'll find there several links and documents that are easy to access. And thanks for joining us. For Ephesoft and IDG, I'm Stan Gibson.